The wind howled through the towering pine trees as Alex maneuvered his truck down the winding dirt road. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had settled over the forest like a suffocating blanket. He glanced at the GPS on his phone. No signal. Typical. The further he drove into Black Hollow Forest, the more he regretted taking this job. But a paycheck was a paycheck. Alex was a freelance surveyor hired by a land development company to map out a potential campsite deep in the heart of Black Hollow. The locals had warned him. Stories of missing hikers, ghostly whispers, and strange figures in the trees had turned this place into one of the most feared locations in Pennsylvania. But Alex wasn't superstitious. He had explored plenty of forests, spent nights alone in the wild. He wasn't afraid of campfire stories. The road ended at a clearing. Alex killed the engine, stepped out, and stretched. The air was colder than he expected, and the silence was unsettling. Not a single cricket chirped. No rustling of small animals, just an eerie stillness that pressed against him like an invisible weight. He grabbed his backpack, strapped on his headlamp, and started into the woods, following an old, barely visible trail. The map he had printed out showed a small abandoned ranger station a few miles in, his base for the night. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The deeper he went, the heavier the air felt. Shadows twisted unnaturally in the beam of his headlamp, branches gnarled like skeletal fingers reaching out. He told himself it was just the fog playing tricks. An hour passed before he reached the ranger station, a dilapidated wooden cabin barely standing. The windows were broken, the door slightly ajar. Alex hesitated. The structure looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. If the company planned to build anything here, they'd need more than just his survey reports. Pushing open the door, he stepped inside. Dust swirled in the light of his headlamp. The interior was sparse. An old wooden desk, rusted filing cabinets, a cot covered in moth-eaten blankets. The air smelled of mildew and something else. Something rotten. As he set up his gear, something scraped against the window. He froze, heart hammering. Just a tree branch, he told himself. He pulled out his radio and pressed the button. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Static. The signal was useless out here. After eating a quick meal, he unrolled his sleeping bag on the cot. The wind outside had picked up, whispering through the trees like distant voices. He turned off his headlamp, but sleep didn't come easy. The feeling of being watched never left him. A loud thump jolted him awake. The cabin was pitch black. He fumbled for his headlamp and clicked it on. The front door was wide open, creaking on rusted hinges. His breath hitched. Stepping cautiously toward the entrance, he swept the light outside. Nothing. Just the fog rolling between the trees. He stepped out, scanning the area. The forest was dead silent, but something didn't feel right. Then he saw them, footprints in the dirt. Bare. Human. Fresh. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the fog. Alex swallowed hard. No way he was following them. He locked the door, double-checked it, and sat against the wall, gripping his hunting knife. He wasn't alone. Hours passed. The wind screamed through the trees, and at some point, he must have dozed off because he woke up to something whispering right in his ear. A woman's voice. Leave. He bolted upright, cold sweat dripping down his spine. His headlamp flickered. The temperature had dropped. His breath curled in the air, and then a shadow moved in the corner of the cabin. His light caught the figure for only a second. A woman. Pale skin, long black hair hanging over her face, wearing a tattered nightgown soaked in mud. Her eyes, empty black pits, locked onto him before she rushed forward. Alex screamed, stumbling back. The light flickered again. She was gone. Panting, he scrambled to pack his gear. Screw the job. Screw the money. He was leaving. He slung his backpack on and threw open the door. The footprints were gone, but the trees had shifted. The trail he had come in on no longer existed. The forest had swallowed it whole. Panic set in. He ran, blindly pushing through the underbrush, branches clawing at his clothes. He didn't care where he went as long as it was away from that cabin. Then he heard it, the footsteps behind him. At first they matched his pace. Then they sped up. Running. Chasing. He didn't dare look back. He could hear breathing now, raspy and unnatural. He burst into a clearing and stopped cold. There were figures hanging from the trees. Dozens of them, nooses wrapped around their necks, swaying gently, their hollow eyes staring at him. His stomach churned. He stepped back. A hand grabbed his ankle. He screamed, kicking wildly. A pale, skeletal hand was reaching out from the earth itself. More hands began clawing up from the dirt. Rotten fingers, broken nails, pulling, grasping. Alex tore free and ran, his mind a blur of terror. He didn't stop until he saw the headlights of his truck. He threw himself inside, locked the doors, and gunned it. The forest didn't fight him this time. The road was clear. The fog had lifted. It wasn't until he was miles away that he dared to look in the rearview mirror. She was sitting in the back seat. Her hollow black eyes met his before the world around him went dark.
Story number 2.
The town of Ashwood had always been surrounded by dense, untamed woods. Generations had passed down stories about the forest, stories of people vanishing, of eerie whispers floating through the trees, of shadows moving where none should be. But those were just legends, warnings meant to keep children from wandering too far. At least that's what Daniel always believed. Daniel was a photographer with a fascination for abandoned places and eerie landscapes. When he heard about Blackwood Forest, an untouched stretch of wilderness deep in Ashwood, he knew he had to explore it. The locals warned him not to go. "People go in there and don't come back," an old man at the diner had muttered. Daniel laughed it off. The morning of his trip, he packed his camera, flashlight, extra batteries, and a hunting knife, just in case. He drove out to the old, overgrown trailhead. The sun hung low, casting long shadows through the trees. Birds chirped overhead, and for the first hour, the forest seemed normal. Peaceful, even. As he moved deeper in, something felt wrong. The trees grew denser, their gnarled roots twisting like veins in the earth. The air became unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, just silence pressing against his ears. He swallowed hard, shaking off the unease. Then he saw it, a cabin deep in the woods. He hadn't expected to find a structure this far in. It looked ancient, weathered by time, its wooden planks dark and rotting. He raised his camera and snapped a few pictures. Something about it made his skin crawl. As he stepped closer, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees like voices just beyond understanding. The door hung slightly open, swaying with the breeze. Against his better judgment, he pushed it open. Inside, dust hung in the air, disturbed by his intrusion. The floor creaked beneath his boots. A wooden table sat in the center, deep scratches covering its surface. The fireplace was cold, its bricks blackened with age. Old furniture draped in white sheets lined the walls. He lifted his camera and took another shot. That's when he noticed something. The sheets over the furniture, they weren't still. They pulsed slightly, as if something underneath was breathing. A cold chill ran down his spine. He took a step back. The door behind him slammed shut. He spun around, gripping the handle, but it wouldn't budge. His heart pounded. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating. Then, a soft creak from behind him. Slowly, he turned. The sheets had slipped from the furniture, revealing figures. Human-like shapes made of twisted wood, their faces carved with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. One of them moved. Daniel stumbled back, yanking at the door, his breath coming in short gasps. The wooden figures turned toward him, their carved mouths opening wider. A whisper slid through the room. "Join us." The door flew open. He didn't question it. He ran. The forest had changed. The trees were closer together, their trunks twisting unnaturally. The path he had taken was gone. The ground felt softer, almost like it was breathing beneath his feet. A snapping sound behind him, branches breaking. Footsteps. Something was following him. He sprinted, weaving through the trees, his breath ragged. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision. He risked a glance over his shoulder and regretted it instantly. The figures from the cabin were chasing him. Their wooden limbs moved unnaturally fast, their carved faces frozen in grotesque expressions. His foot caught on a root and he crashed to the ground. Pain shot through his leg. He scrambled up just as a branch shaped like a hand, grazed his ankle. Daniel ran blindly, no longer sure of which direction would lead him out. Then, in the distance, light, a break in the trees, his truck. Hope surged through him. He pushed himself harder, ignoring the burning in his lungs. The whispers grew louder, the trees closing in, as if the forest itself was trying to keep him inside. He burst into the clearing and yanked open his truck door. The moment he was inside, he locked it, his hands shaking as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. Something slammed against the window. One of the wooden figures stood inches from the glass, its carved eyes boring into his. Its mouth moved. No sound came out. Daniel didn't wait. He floored the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as he sped out of the clearing. His heart pounded as he watched the tree line in his rearview mirror. The figures stood there, unmoving, watching. Only when he reached the highway did he allow himself to breathe. Daniel never spoke about what happened in Blackwood Forest, but weeks later he developed the photos from that day. Most were normal. The trees, the cabin, but in the last few shots, just behind him in the shadows, he saw them. The figures. And in the final photo, taken just before he ran, one of them was right behind him, its wooden hand reaching for his shoulder. Daniel burned the pictures. But sometimes at night, he still heard the whispers. And when he looked into the woods behind his house, he swore the trees moved closer.
Story number 3.
The road to Grayson Woods was barely visible beneath the layers of dead leaves. Thomas adjusted his backpack and took a deep breath before stepping past the old wooden sign, its paint faded with age. It read, "Do not enter after dark." It was just a warning, he told himself. A relic of Old Town superstition. For years, people had talked about Grayson Woods, about the ones who went in and never came out, about the whispers that came from the trees, about the things that watched from the shadows. But Thomas wasn't afraid. He was a rational man. He had spent years hiking through abandoned places, exploring ghost towns, and venturing into so-called haunted forests. Nothing had ever happened. This time wouldn't be any different. The air was colder than he expected, even for autumn. The deeper he walked into the forest, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling animals, just the sound of his own boots crunching against the ground. After about an hour, he found what he was looking for. The cabin. It was a simple structure, long abandoned, its roof sagging and windows shattered. This was the place from the stories, the place where a family once lived before they all disappeared. Thomas pulled out his camera and started snapping photos. The eerie silence made him uneasy, but he pushed the feeling away. He stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning under his weight, and pushed the door open. Inside, dust swirled in the light from his flashlight. The cabin was small, just one main room with a stone fireplace, a rusted-out stove, and a wooden table. Scraps of furniture were scattered about, covered in grime and cobwebs. But something felt wrong. He stepped deeper inside. The smell of damp wood and decay thick in the air. His flashlight flickered. Then he heard it, a soft, distant knock. Thomas froze. He turned toward the door, but there was nothing outside except the shifting trees. The sound hadn't come from there. It had come from inside the cabin. He swept his flashlight across the room, his pulse quickening. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 slow, deliberate taps. It was coming from beneath him, the floorboards. His breath caught in his throat. He crouched down, brushing away the dirt. There, barely visible, was a trapdoor. As he hesitated, every instinct told him to leave. But curiosity won. Slowly, he gripped the rusted handle and pulled. The wood groaned, revealing a dark, gaping hole. The air that rose from below was ice cold, carrying with it a stench of something long dead. He shone his flashlight inside. A staircase led down into the darkness. He should have turned back, but he didn't. Carefully, he descended, his breathing shallow. The wooden steps creaked beneath him. The walls down here were wrong, not made of wood, but of stone, damp and uneven, as if they had been carved by hand. The air was suffocating. The deeper he went, the more he felt it. A presence. At the bottom of the stairs was a narrow tunnel. Old wooden beams barely held up the ceiling. The walls were covered in deep scratches, not from tools, from fingernails. Something had been trapped down here. His flashlight flickered again. His stomach tightened. The tunnel stretched on, vanishing into darkness. But ahead he saw something. A door. Unlike the rest of the tunnel, the door was pristine, untouched by time. It shouldn't have been there. A single word was carved into the wood. Hungry. Thomas swallowed hard. Every part of him screamed to leave. But something else, something deep inside, urged him forward. He reached for the handle. The door swung open on its own. The room beyond was massive. The air was thick with rot, and in the center of the room was a table. A long wooden table, covered in old, stained plates, half-rotted food still sitting on them, as if left in the middle of a meal. And the chairs, there were people sitting in them. No, not people. Corpses. Their flesh was dried and tight against their skulls, their hands still clutching utensils, their hollow eye sockets staring at him. Some had their mouths open in silent screams. Others had deep scratches in their arms, as if they had tried to eat themselves. Thomas stumbled back, gagging. Then he heard it. A voice. "Are you here to feed us?" The words crawled down his spine like ice. Slowly, he turned. The figures were moving. A low creaking filled the air as their heads turned toward him, their jawbones cracking as they began to smile. The flashlight died. The darkness swallowed him. Thomas didn't think. He ran. His hands scraped against the tunnel walls as he blindly felt his way back. He tripped, fell, scrambled to his feet, the whispers growing louder behind him. He reached the stairs, clawing his way up. The air was heavier now, like something was trying to pull him back. He threw himself through the trapdoor, slamming it shut. The whispers stopped. The air cleared. For a long moment, he sat there, shaking. The flashlight flickered back to life, casting its dim glow across the room. Then something knocked from beneath the floorboards. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Thomas bolted. He didn't stop running until he reached his truck. He sped down the dirt road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. By the time he reached town, he was gasping for breath. He parked outside the diner and stumbled inside. The old man at the counter looked up, his expression grim. "You went into Grayson Woods, didn't you?" Thomas didn't answer. The old man sighed. "You should leave town, now, before it follows you home." Thomas didn't believe him, not at first, but that night, as he lay in his motel room, he heard it again. A soft, distant knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps, coming from beneath the bed.
Story number 4.
The old highway leading to Raven's Hollow was barely used anymore, its cracked pavement swallowed by encroaching trees. They called it the Lost Road, a stretch of highway that had been abandoned decades ago after too many accidents, too many disappearances. But Evan didn't believe in ghost stories. He was a journalist, always chasing urban legends and local folklore. When he heard about Raven's Hollow, the town that simply vanished, he knew he had to investigate. There were records of the town existing up until 1956, then nothing. No census reports, no land deeds, no official documentation. Just gone. The sun was setting as Evan drove down the desolate road, his GPS flickering in and out. The trees grew denser, their skeletal branches reaching overhead, turning the road into a tunnel of shadows. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. Then he saw it. A rusted road sign barely standing. The words were almost unreadable beneath layers of rust. "Welcome to Raven's Hollow." Evan slowed the car, peering ahead. Fog curled across the pavement. Then, through the mist, he saw something else, a figure standing in the middle of the road. His heart jumped. He slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop just feet from the figure. It was a woman. She wore a tattered dress, her long black hair hanging over her face. She didn't move, didn't react. Evan hesitated, then rolled down his window. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman twitched, just slightly. Then, slowly, her head tilted toward him. That's when he saw her eyes. They weren't human. They were black, empty. A shudder ran through him. Every instinct screamed, "Leave." He pressed the gas. The car lurched forward, but as he passed her, she vanished. Evan's breath came in sharp gasps. He gripped the wheel, forcing himself to focus. Just a trick of the light, maybe someone messing with him. But then out of the corner of his eye, movement. He turned his head. The woman was sitting in the back seat. Evan's scream caught in his throat. The car swerved wildly as he fought to stay on the road. Then, darkness. Evan woke to silence. His head throbbed. His car had stalled, the headlights barely illuminating the thick fog ahead. He was somewhere else now. The road was gone. Instead, he was parked on a narrow dirt path leading into a town. Raven's Hollow. It looked frozen in time, weathered brick buildings, rusted streetlights, old-fashioned storefronts with broken windows. A thick layer of dust covered everything, as if no one had set foot here in decades. Yet the town felt alive. Evans stepped out of the car. The air was thick with decay. A distant sound, like whispering, echoed through the empty streets. He grabbed his camera and started walking. The first thing he noticed was the lack of cars. No rusted frames, no abandoned vehicles, just emptiness. It was as if the entire town had simply walked away. Then he saw the signs. Not street signs, not business names. Handwritten signs, nailed to doors, scrawled in frantic, uneven letters. "Don't look at them. They walk at night. If you hear your name, run." His stomach twisted. A soft shuffle echoed from an alleyway. Evan turned sharply, his flashlight cutting through the dark. Nothing. Just an old toy, a porcelain doll lying abandoned in the dust. Then footsteps. Not his own. Someone was behind him. Slowly he turned. A figure stood at the end of the street. A man, dressed in 1950s clothes. His suit was torn, his skin too pale, his eyes completely black. Evan stumbled back. The man didn't move. He just smiled. Then another figure appeared. Then another. They stepped from the shadows, emerging from alleys, doorways, creeping toward him without a sound. Evan. He didn't know where he was going, just away. He sprinted through the town, the whispers rising, his own breath ragged in his ears. The figures were following. He reached a church. The doors hung open, rotting on their hinges. He threw himself inside, slamming the doors behind him. Silence. His heart pounded as he pressed against the wood. Then, a voice. Right behind him. "You shouldn't have come." He turned. The woman from the road stood in the center of the church. Only now he could see her face. Her skin was stretched too tightly over her bones. Her mouth was wrong, jagged, too wide. Her lips split like something that had been stitched together and then torn apart. She took a step forward. Her feet didn't touch the ground. Evan backed away. "What is this place?" His voice barely worked. She smiled. "Home." Behind her, the shadows moved. Dozens of figures crawled from the darkness, their bodies twitching unnaturally, their hollow eyes locked onto him. Evan turned and ran. Through the doors, into the streets. His lungs burned, but he didn't stop. The town blurred around him. The whispers screamed in his ears. Then, the road. His car was there, headlights still on, engine still running. The figures were behind him. He threw himself inside, hit the gas, the tires spun, dirt flying, then the town was gone. The road stretched ahead, empty. The trees were still. His breath came in short gasps. He checked the rearview mirror. No one was there. Just the fog. And then a whisper from the back seat. "We let you go, but we will be waiting." Evan didn't look. He just kept driving. And he never went back. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, he still hears them whispering his name.
Story number 5.
The road leading to Hollow Creek was empty, swallowed by dense trees on both sides. The deeper Jason drove, the more the forest seemed to close in around him. His headlights barely cut through the thick fog curling along the pavement. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic. He checked the GPS. The screen glitched, flickering between his location and a blank void. Then, just like that, no signal. Jason cursed under his breath. He had been driving for hours, trying to find the abandoned town his grandfather had warned him about. The one no maps showed. If you find it, leave. Don't stop. Don't look back. Jason didn't believe in ghost stories. He was a filmmaker, always searching for eerie locations for his next project. Hollow Creek was perfect, a ghost town with no record of why it had been abandoned. The car sputtered. Then it stalled. Jason's stomach dropped. He turned the key. Nothing. His breath fogged the windshield. Silence pressed in around him, thick and suffocating. Then a knock. It came from behind the car. Jason's hands tightened on the wheel. His pulse hammered in his ears. Slowly, he turned his head. The fog had shifted. A figure stood just outside the reach of his headlights. Jason swallowed hard. "Hello?" The figure twitched. Its limbs moved wrong, jerky and unnatural. It took a step forward. Jason's blood turned to ice. He hit the locks. Click, click. The figure moved closer. Jason forced himself to breathe. It was just a person. Maybe a lost hiker, maybe a prank. He turned the key again. The engine sputtered. Died. The figure was at the driver's side window now. Jason's breath hitched. It was a woman, or at least something shaped like one. Her face was stretched too tightly over her skull, her skin pale and slick, almost like wet paper. Her mouth hung open wider than it should, her lips torn and bleeding. Her eyes were black, hollow. Jason couldn't scream. He just froze. The woman raised her hand. A long, torn fingernail scraped the glass. Jason turned the key again. The car roared to life. He didn't think. He floored it. The car lurched forward, tires kicking up gravel. In the rearview mirror, the woman didn't move. She stood in the fog, her mouth still open, that horrible smile frozen in place. Then, just as Jason thought he was free, she wasn't alone. More figures stepped out of the fog. Dozens. Pale, hollow-eyed, all staring. Jason's stomach turned. He pressed the gas harder. The fog thickened. Then, the town appeared. Old buildings rose through the mist, their wood rotting, windows shattered. It looked frozen in time, like it had been abandoned overnight. Jason's breath came in sharp gasps. He had made it. But something was wrong. The town, it wasn't empty. Figures stood in the streets. Lifeless, motionless, watching. Jason swerved, his tires screeching against the cracked pavement. He had to get out. He had to. Then he saw it. The sign. It stood at the edge of the town, barely hanging by rusted chains. "Welcome home, Jason." His veins turned to ice. His foot slammed on the brakes. How did they know his name? A whisper slid through the air. Jason whipped his head toward the sound. The figures in the street were moving. Their bodies jerked and twitched, their heads snapping toward him at unnatural angles. The whispers grew louder. Jason's vision blurred. His hands trembled. He slammed the car into reverse. The engine sputtered. The figures were closer now. The whispering turned to laughter. Jason's body locked in place. His vision darkened. Then everything went silent. Jason woke up in the driver's seat. The sun was shining. Birds chirped. The fog was gone. His hands still gripped the wheel. His heart pounded against his ribs. Had it been a dream? He exhaled shakily. He was fine. It was just his mind playing tricks. Then his phone buzzed. Jason hesitated. Slowly, he picked it up. One new photo in his camera roll. His stomach twisted. He hadn't taken any pictures. He clicked on it. The image wasn't of the town. It was of him, asleep, in the car, with the woman standing right outside his window, smiling. Jason dropped the phone. His breath hitched. Then a soft knock on the window.
Story number 6.
The Gray Pines Forest had always been a place of whispered warnings. Locals claimed it was cursed, a place where the trees watched and the shadows breathed. People who entered after dark never came back the same, if they came back at all. James didn't believe in any of that. He was a documentary filmmaker, drawn to places shrouded in myth. The stories of missing hikers, strange lights, and the thing that lurked between the trees were exactly what he needed for his next project. So, on a cold October evening, James stepped into Gray Pines with nothing but a camera, a flashlight, and a knife strapped to his belt. The deeper he walked, the quieter the world became. At first, he heard the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen animals in the underbrush. But after an hour, the silence settled. Too quiet. No insects, no wind, just nothing. James checked his watch, 8:47 p.m. He lifted his camera, filming the dense forest around him. Day 1, entering Gray Pines, where locals believe the forest itself is alive. He turned the camera on himself, forcing a grin. Let's see if we can find some ghosts. Then, a sound. A soft clicking. James froze. It came from behind him. He turned, shining his flashlight. Nothing but trees. Then the clicking came again. It was closer. James's skin crawled. He swallowed hard, gripping his camera tighter. Probably just an animal, he muttered. But something about the sound felt wrong. Then he saw it. A tree. Just like the hundreds around it, but different. It had a mouth. James staggered back, his heart slamming against his ribs. It wasn't bark. It was skin, stretched and cracked, lips peeling back to reveal jagged, blackened teeth. The mouth moved. The clicking was coming from inside. James bolted. His feet pounded against the forest floor. The flashlight beam shook wildly as he ran. He didn't know where he was going, just away. Then he tripped. His body slammed into the dirt, his camera skidding ahead. Pain shot through his knee. He gasped, rolling onto his back, and saw the trees moving, not swaying in the wind, shifting, changing. Their trunks twisted, gnarled branches reaching for him like fingers. The mouths in the bark grinned, their clicking turning into laughter. James scrambled up, grabbing his camera with shaking hands. Then, a voice. Not right. It came from everywhere at once. Why do you run? James's blood turned to ice. His flashlight flickered. A shadow moved between the trees. Not an animal, not a person. Something else. Tall. Wrong. Its limbs were too long. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, they weren't eyes. Just holes. Empty, gaping holes that sucked in the light. James couldn't breathe. The thing stepped forward, its foot crunching against leaves, and the forest screamed. The trees groaned, their mouths stretching wider. The clicking became a frenzy. James ran. He didn't look back. He didn't stop until he saw it. A cabin. Rotting, half sunken into the earth, its door hanging open like a waiting mouth. But he had no choice. He threw himself inside, slamming the door. His breath came in ragged gasps. Silence. His flashlight flickered again, barely illuminating the dust-choked air. Then, a whisper. Right behind him. James turned slowly. The cabin wasn't empty. In the corner, a man sat, hunched over. His back was to James, his hands twitching against the wooden floor. His fingernails were missing. James's stomach churned. "Sir?" His voice was barely a whisper. The man didn't react. James took a step closer. The flashlight trembled in his grip. The man jerked. His neck twisted too far, too fast. James froze. The man's face was rotting. Skin hung in strips, his lips peeled back in a grotesque grin. His eyes were missing, and yet he was looking at James. His mouth moved. Click! Click! James staggered back. The walls of the cabin began to move. The wood rippled, mouths open in the logs, whispering, laughing. James grabbed his camera and ran. The forest swallowed him. The trees shifted, trying to trap him. Shadows twisted. The clicking was everywhere. Then a road, his car, right where he left it. James didn't think. He threw himself inside, slamming the door. His hands shook as he jammed the keys into the ignition. The car started. He didn't look at the trees as he peeled away, didn't look at the thing standing at the tree line, didn't look at its smiling face. James never spoke about what happened. He deleted the footage. He moved to the city. But at night, when the wind howled through the streets, he still heard the clicking. And he knew the forest remembered him. And one day it would call him back.
Story number 7.
The Devil's Nest was a stretch of forest no one dared to enter. People whispered about strange lights, lost time, and the figures that watched from the trees. The few who ventured in spoke of the overwhelming feeling of being followed, of whispers in their ears, of things they couldn't explain. Sam didn't believe in any of it. He was an avid camper, a man who prided himself on his survival skills. He had hiked the deepest wilderness, scaled the tallest peaks. Superstition wouldn't keep him from proving the legends wrong. So one cold autumn afternoon, he stepped into Devil's Nest. The first few hours were uneventful. The forest was thick, the trees towering high enough to block out most of the sun. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. Birds stopped singing, the wind didn't move the leaves. By dusk, an unnatural silence had settled. Sam set up camp in a small clearing. He built a fire, ate his meal, and filmed a short video for his hiking blog. Day 1 in the so-called haunted woods. No ghosts, no demons, just another quiet night in nature. Then a sound, a soft click, click, click. Sam froze. It came from beyond the firelight. He grabbed his flashlight and turned it toward the noise. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but trees. Then movement. Something darted between the trunks. Sam's grip tightened around the flashlight. Who's there? His voice came out steady, but his heart pounded. Silence. Then whispers. Faint. Too soft to understand. Sam's mouth went dry. He took a slow step toward the edge of the clearing. Hello? The whispers stopped. And then a voice right behind him. You shouldn't be here. Sam spun around. No one was there. The fire crackled, throwing long shadows against the trees. His own breath sounded too loud in the quiet. A shiver crawled down his spine. He forced out a chuckle, trying to shake the unease. It's just my mind playing tricks. But still, he kept his knife close as he crawled into his tent. Sam awoke to scratching. Faint, deliberate, right outside the tent. His pulse slammed against his ribs. He reached for his flashlight. His fingers fumbled in the dark. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then something pressed against the fabric. A handprint. Fingers too long. Sam stopped breathing. His brain screamed, "Don't move. Don't make a sound." Then the zipper of his tent started to slide down. Slow, deliberate, Sam lunged forward, grabbing the zipper and yanking it shut. His other hand closed around his knife. Silence. Then laughter. Low, croaking. It came from all around him. Sam's chest heaved. He counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Then the tent collapsed. Something pushed down from above, pressing him against the ground. The fabric wrapped around him like a cocoon. He slashed with the knife. The weight lifted. Sam burst out of the tent, gasping. The fire had burned low. Shadows moved between the trees, shifting and twisting like living things. Then he saw them. Figures, standing at the edge of the clearing. Dozens, faceless, watching. Sam grabbed his backpack and ran. He didn't stop. The forest was wrong. The path he had taken was gone. The trees unfamiliar. The shadows moved when he wasn't looking. Then footsteps, matching his pace. The whispers returned. His name, over and over. Sam's breath came in ragged gasps. He stumbled, nearly falling, and the figures stepped closer. Their bodies jerked, their limbs bending wrong. Sam sprinted. The trees blurred past him. The forest groaned, breathing. Then he saw it. A cabin. The only structure for miles. He didn't think. He ran inside, slamming the door behind him. The cabin stank of rot. The floor was covered in dirt and old bones. The walls were covered in scratches. Then he saw the words, carved into the wood, over and don't look at them. Don't speak to them. They know you're here. Sam's stomach turned. A thump came from the roof. He froze. Another thump, then a voice, soft, familiar. His own voice. "Let me in?" Sam's blood ran cold. The doorknob twisted. Sam backed away. His foot hit something. A body. Shriveled. Mummified. Its face frozen in a silent scream. Then he saw the camera clutched in its hands. Sam's hands shook as he pressed play. Static. Then a video of himself, sitting in the cabin, eyes wide, unblinking. Then he smiled and whispered, "It's too late." The screen flickered. Then a face appeared. Right behind him, the cabin door burst open. Darkness swallowed him. Sam was never seen again, but weeks later his camera was found lying at the forest's edge. The last recording? A video of him, standing in the woods, smiling and whispering, "Come find me."
Story number 8.
The town of Black Hollow had one rule: never enter the woods after dark. Nobody could say why exactly, but the stories passed down for generations all told the same tale. If you went in, you wouldn't come out the same. Some people vanished without a trace. Others returned days later, their minds shattered, whispering nonsense about figures in the trees and voices calling their names. Emma didn't believe in ghost stories. She was a journalist, and she wanted the truth. Were the disappearances real, or was it all small-town superstition? So armed with nothing but a flashlight, a camera, and a stubborn refusal to be scared, she stepped into the Black Hollow woods. The trees loomed high, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The deeper Emma walked, the more the world changed. The air felt thicker. The silence pressed against her ears. No birds, no wind. She checked her watch. 8:57 p.m. She turned on her camera. All right, we're officially inside the so-called cursed woods. Nothing weird so far. Then a snap. Emma froze. Something had moved behind her. She turned, shining her flashlight. The beam cut through the thick trees, illuminating nothing but tangled branches and damp earth. Then a whisper. Soft. Right next to her ear. Emma. Her breath caught in her throat. She was alone. She swallowed hard and shook it off. Just the wind. Just my mind playing tricks. But still, she moved faster. After an hour of walking, the path disappeared. Her GPS glitched. The screen flickered between her location and nothingness. Emma frowned, tapping the screen. No signal. Then her flashlight flickered. She smacked it against her palm. The light sputtered. Died. Darkness swallowed the forest. Emma's heart pounded. She fumbled for her phone, using its screen to cast a dim glow. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Coming toward her. She spun around. Who's there? Silence. She took a shaky breath. Stay calm. Think rationally. Then a figure stepped out from the trees. Emma's stomach dropped. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one, but something was wrong. Her skin was too pale, almost gray. Her clothes were soaked, muddy, tattered. Her eyes, black, empty, wrong. The woman smiled and whispered, "Run." Emma did. She didn't think, didn't question. She ran. Branches tore at her arms. The shadows moved. The whispers grew louder. Then laughter. Not human, not right. It came from everywhere. Emma's pulse slammed against her ribs. Her lungs burned. She turned a corner, and there it was. A cabin, rotting, sinking into the earth. She had no choice. She raced inside, slamming the door. The air reeked of rot. The walls moved. Emma's breath came in sharp gasps. She clicked on her phone light and froze. The room was covered in scratches, deep gouges in the wood, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Then she saw the words, "Don't look at them." Her pulse stopped. Then a knock, soft, gentle, right behind her. Emma turned slowly. The door was open. The woman stood there, closer, smiling. Emma's body locked up. Then a hand reached from the darkness. Cold, rotten, it grabbed her wrist, screamed. The world split apart. Tash, tash, she woke up in her car. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, her hands trembled. Her phone was in her lap, one new video. Emma's stomach churned. She didn't remember filming anything. With shaking hands, she pressed play. The screen flickered. It was her, standing in the woods, her eyes black. She smiled and whispered, "Come back."
Story number 9.
The town of Coldwater had always feared the Hollow Creek forest. Nobody spoke about why. They just warned newcomers to stay away. They whispered about strange figures, about lost time, about the ones who never came back. Jason didn't believe in local legends. He was a nature photographer, always hunting for the perfect shot. The untouched beauty of Hollow Creek was too tempting to resist. So on a crisp autumn evening, as the last light faded from the sky, he stepped into the woods. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. The deeper he walked, the heavier the air felt, like the forest was watching, waiting. Jason set up his camera, adjusting the focus. Day 1. Hollow Creek Forest. Let's see if the legends are true. Then, a sound, a snap. Jason turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just as he was about to brush it off, a figure moved between the trunks. Jason's stomach tightened. His camera whirred, adjusting to the low light. He squinted. The figure stood just beyond the trees. Tall. Too tall. Jason lifted his camera, snapped a photo. The flash lit up the darkness for a split second, and the figure vanished. Jason's breath came fast. He checked his camera screen. The photo was wrong. The trees were there, but the figure wasn't. Instead, there was something else. Smiling face. Inside the tree. Jason's stomach dropped. He lifted his flashlight, shining it at the nearest trunk. The bark moved, not swaying in the breeze, shifting, breathing. Then the whispering started. Soft, too close. Jason ran. He didn't stop until he reached a small clearing. His chest heaved, his legs ached, his camera was gone. He must have dropped it, but he wasn't going back. Something wasn't right. Then footsteps, crunching leaves. Jason spun around. His flashlight flickered. The trees moved. Branches twisted, forming faces, grinning, whispering, watching. Then he saw the cabin. Old, rotting, hidden between the trees. He had no choice. He ran inside. The air stank of damp wood and decay. The walls were covered in scratches. Jason's stomach churned. He ran his fingers over the deep gouges in the wood. Handprints. Then he saw the writing. Don't look at them. Don't speak to them. Don't stay after dark. Then knock. Soft, gentle. Jason's pulse froze. Another knock. He turned slowly. The door was open. A figure stood in the doorway. Tall. Wrong. Its face was his. Jason's own eyes stared back at him. Then it smiled. Jason's vision blurred. His head pounded. The world tilted. Then darkness. He woke up in his car. The sun was rising. His camera sat on the passenger seat. His hands shook as he turned it on. One new photo. Jason's breath caught in his throat. It was him, standing in the forest, smiling and whispering, "Come back."
Story number 10.
The old folks in Raven Hollow always said the woods beyond Blackridge Road were cursed, not haunted. Cursed. People didn't just see ghosts there, they disappeared. Or worse, they came back. Wrong. Ethan didn't believe in curses. He was a thrill seeker, the kind of guy who chased storms and explored abandoned houses for fun. When he heard about the lost town of Ashwood, hidden deep in those cursed woods, he knew he had to see it for himself. One October evening, as the last bit of sun faded behind the hills, he stepped into the forest. At first, it was just another hike. The trees were ancient, their twisted limbs reaching toward the sky like bony fingers. A heavy mist rolled through the underbrush, curling around his boots. After an hour, the silence set in. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just dead, heavy air. Ethan checked his phone. No signal. His GPS had frozen on the loading screen. Still, he pushed on. Then he saw a house. Not a ruin like he expected, but intact. The windows were dark, the wooden walls warped with age, but it was standing. Ethan raised his camera, snapped a picture, then a flicker of movement in the window. He froze. It had been fast. A shadow, gone before he could focus. He swallowed hard. Hello? Silence. Then the front door creaked open. Ethan stepped inside. The air smelled like rot. The wooden floor groaned under his weight. Cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was waiting. His flashlight flickered. Then a whisper, right behind him. "Help me." Ethan spun around. Nothing. A cold chill ran through him. His gut told him to leave, but his curiosity pushed him forward. The house was bigger than it looked. Hallways stretched longer than they should. Doors led to places they shouldn't. Then he found the room. It was covered in mirrors. Floor to ceiling, every inch of the walls reflected his pale, wide-eyed face. Ethan swallowed hard. He raised his camera. Then a handprint appeared in the mirror. Not his. It pressed against the glass from the other side. His breath hitched. Then a second handprint. A third. A dozen. They spread across the mirrors. Then a face, his own, but grinning. His reflection's head tilted, twisted. Its mouth stretched too wide. Then it stepped forward. Ethan stumbled back, but his reflection did not. It watched him, smiling, waiting. Then it reached through the glass. Ethan screamed. The world split apart. He woke up in the woods. Dew clung to his skin, his clothes were damp, the sun had just started to rise. Had he passed out? Then he saw the house. Or what was left of it? It was a ruin. Collapsing beams. Nothing but a burned-out shell. His stomach twisted. No, that's not possible. He had been inside. He had seen. Ethan's breath caught. His camera, it was still strapped around his neck. With shaking fingers, he turned it on. One new photo. His heart stopped. It was him, standing in front of the mirrors, but his reflection was smiling and whispering, "See you soon."
Story number 11.
The wind howled through the skeletal branches of Black Hollow Forest, carrying whispers that no living soul could explain. A place cursed by time and tragedy, Black Hollow had claimed countless wanderers, their bodies never found, only their cries left behind in the wind. Ethan, a seasoned hiker and urban explorer, wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories. He scoffed at the tales of eerie figures lurking between the trees and the spectral voices calling from the darkness. It was just another overhyped local legend, a way to keep thrill seekers like himself at bay. He had heard it all before. Don't enter Black Hollow at night, don't stray from the path, and above all, never answer when something calls your name. Yet here he was, standing at the forest's edge under the light of the full moon, his flashlight slicing through the mist that clung to the ground like ghostly fingers. He checked his gear. Knife, compass, extra batteries. He'd camp overnight, record his experience, and prove once and for all that Black Hollow was nothing more than a creepy old forest with a bad reputation. The deeper Ethan ventured, the quieter the world became. No rustling of leaves, no chirping of crickets, just an unnatural silence that pressed against his ears. He paused, glancing around. It felt as if the trees were closing in, their twisted limbs reaching for him. Shaking off the unease, he pressed forward, following a barely visible path that wove between the trees. An hour passed. His camera caught only shifting shadows and the endless stretch of gnarled branches. Frustration gnawed at him. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe the horror stories were just campfire tales meant to spook children. He exhaled sharply and set up his small tent in a clearing. The moon hung directly overhead, its glow casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. As he settled into his sleeping bag, a soft rustling drifted through the trees. At first, he ignored it. Probably a deer or some other small animal. But then he heard it again, closer this time. A dry, crackling sound like footsteps on brittle leaves. He sat up, his pulse quickening. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed by the night. No response. Gripping his flashlight, he unzipped the tent and peered outside. The forest was empty. He swept the beam of light across the trees. Nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to him like a second skin. Then, just as he was about to retreat inside, a voice whispered his name. Ethan. His breath hitched. It had come from the trees, soft yet unmistakable. Every rational part of him screamed that it was the wind playing tricks on his ears. But deep down, he knew better. Slowly, he backed into his tent and zipped it up, forcing himself to stay calm. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. He gripped the knife from his pack, the cold metal grounding him. Another whisper slithered through the air. "Ethan, come here." The voice was closer now. Panic crawled up his spine. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it to be a dream, a trick of his tired mind. But then the whisper turned into something worse. Laughter. Faint at first, then rising, multiplying, surrounding him from all sides. His flashlight flickered. The laughter stopped, and then the tent collapsed. Ethan fought against the fabric as it tangled around him, clawing his way out. The moment he emerged, his breath caught in his throat. Figures stood between the trees, their forms barely more than shadows, yet their eyes, empty, hollow pits, glowed with an unnatural light. Their mouths hung open as if screaming, but no sound came out. Ethan bolted. He didn't think, didn't look back. He sprinted through the trees, his breath ragged, his heart hammering against his ribs. Branches clawed at his skin, roots threatened to trip him, but he pushed forward, desperate to escape. Then, a root snared his ankle. He crashed to the ground, pain exploding up his leg. His flashlight skidded away, plunging him into darkness. Shuffling footsteps approached. Terror paralyzed him as he felt a presence kneeling beside him, cold fingers brushing against his face. A whisper caressed his ear. "You shouldn't have come." With a desperate cry, he tore free from the unseen grip, scrambling for his flashlight. When he flicked it on, the figures were gone. Only the wind remained, rustling the dead leaves. Ethan didn't stop running until he burst out of the forest, his lungs burning, his limbs trembling. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew Black Hollow had let him go, but it had marked him, and the whispers would never leave him.